Betrayal changes you. Not only the way you treat people, but also the way you see the world. At the age of 22, Paul learned this the hard way. Just 3 months before their wedding, his fiancée ran off with her ex. She didn't just break his heart. She took his wedding ring and every last cent he had saved for that big day. The consequences were severe. After that, trust was not easy, especially in love. Every new woman he dated had some obvious flaw. Too shallow, too clingy, too distant. Paul ended the relationship even before they went on a second date. Eventually, after years of dead ends and quiet frustration, he gave up completely. He decided that love just wasn't meant for him. Living alone seemed easier, but fate had other plans. Susan didn't just enter Paul's life. She burst into it like a summer thunderstorm. Loud, bright, it was impossible not to notice her. They worked in the same building, although on different floors, and sometimes found themselves at the same dining table. Her colleagues had warned her about him. A typical programmer, they said. Introverted, dismal, a coffee addict. She laughed. In her imagination, she drew a caricature. Glasses, a greasy sweater, a shock of unruly hair. But when she finally saw Paul, she blinked in surprise. That's what he was like. Curly brown hair, quiet charm, and dimples that softened even his most sarcastic remarks. She fell in love with him almost instantly and didn't try to hide it. Their romance captivated them both. Before Paul had time to think about what was going on, she became an integral part of his life. 3 years after that first dinner, they got married. And for the first time since his betrayal, Paul felt that the world might not be such a cruel place after all. A year later, Susan informed him that she was pregnant, and he was overwhelmed with joy, which he thought he would never be able to experience again. 10 years have passed like a blink of an eye. Their son was already in school, but something had changed between them. The warmth that once distinguished their mornings and evenings has cooled. There were no quarrels, no drama, just a quiet, constant distance. It was a kind of unnoticeable breakup that occurs when two people stop being lovers and start living together. They kept up appearances, pretending that everything was fine, and each hoped that the other would eventually break the silence. Paul couldn't shake the feeling that he had become a secondary person in his marriage. Time has not been kind to him. The age difference, which once seemed insignificant, now felt like a chasm. He was about 40, had gray hair at his temples, and his spirit was dulled by the impending midlife crisis. Susan, meanwhile, was still 30, radiant, youthful, with a laugh that still turned heads and a sparkle in her eyes that did not fade. One morning, at their usual breakfast, she looked up and asked, "So, what are we going to do for our anniversary?" Paul, still dazed from a restless night, shrugged his shoulders. "I hadn't really thought about it. Can we have dinner somewhere?" She smiled, running her fingers over her coffee cup. "Nick has an idea. He wants to throw a surprise party for you. You don't have to plan anything. Just come." With his birthday still 6 months away, Paul nodded, too tired to offer anything else. He hadn't been able to plan much lately. With age, interest in important events has dulled. As the date approached, Susan became more and more distracted. She came home later than usual. Her phone was constantly ringing. At first, Paul didn't think much of it. But as the days passed, his thoughts wandered to dark places, the echoes of old betrayals, fears that he thought he had buried. Perhaps Susan was also looking back at the past, remembering wounds she hadn't talked about. Perhaps she was keeping her own secrets. Paul couldn't shake the feeling that Susan might be dating someone else, but he pushed the thought away. It was too much for him, and facing it head-on would only make him feel worse. He convinced himself that the incident with the runaway bride had erected some kind of invisible wall between them, which made it harder for him to trust what they had. Meanwhile, Susan remained completely unaware of the storm brewing in his head. Nicholas, a longtime friend of Susan's husband, was an integral part of their lives, but she always considered him nothing more than a casual acquaintance. He was an ordinary guy with an unusual sense of humor. He often joked about how many children he had scattered all over the world. A common joke when they were all going to drink and laugh. But the situation started to change when they were preparing for Paul's birthday. Nicholas and Susan began to spend more time together, and their bond strengthened. Susan began to see him in a new light. Smart, well-read, a man who could attract her attention in a way that Paul had never been able to. They often lost track of time, immersed in conversations about art, books, and everything that was between them. Only shadows melting into darkness, completely forgetting about the reason why they met in the first place. Their first moment of intimacy came unexpectedly in the car, when they were drinking takeaway coffee, casually discussing the latest nominees for the film award. Susan felt overwhelmed by her feelings for Nicholas. It was hard to believe that all of this was real, and yet it was true. After each meeting, she returned home to Paul, tormented by guilt, feeling both shame and disappointment in herself, trying to make amends. Paul began to notice changes in Susan's behavior. At times she seemed distant, distracted, but he couldn't figure out why. Perhaps he just didn't want to face the unpleasant reality. Then came his 40th birthday, the day that was destined to change everything. A surprise party had been carefully planned in the rented apartment, and everyone was looking forward to his arrival. When he entered, the lights went out, and everyone took their seats. Standing next to Nick, Susan felt his casual touches. His whisper tickled her ear, urging her to behave with restraint. She didn't want to spoil her husband's evening. But Nicholas couldn't help himself. He smiled slyly, bent down, and whispered, "I just can't resist standing next to you like this." Finally, Paul entered the apartment. The lights came on, and the audience burst into applause. The clapping echoed as everyone applauded. Paul, although he wasn't sure how he really felt about this surprise, forced himself to smile, hiding his discomfort. He didn't want to let anyone down, especially those who had worked so hard to make this evening special. In the midst of the celebration, Nicholas, already pretty tipsy, staggered over to Paul. Susan, sensing trouble brewing, quickly slipped away, hoping to keep Nick from saying anything he would regret in front of her husband. Unfortunately, her worst fears were realized. Nicholas, inflamed by alcohol, began to tell intimate details about his brief affair with Susan, calling it nothing more than a meaningless affair. The smell of alcohol permeated his words, invading the space and suppressing Paul's feelings. Paul, who was looking at his drunk friend with cold indifference, did not react at first. He stumbled over to the window, putting a pack of cigarettes on the sill. Betrayal, resentment, and disgust all hit him at the same time, and in a fit of anger, he lashed out at Nicholas. He clenched his fists until they unclenched from the emotion that overwhelmed him. Silence reigned in the hall. The guests did not know what to do with the chaos that broke out in front of them. The guests finally realized the reality of the situation when they noticed Susan, tears streaming down her face, sitting not next to Paul, but next to Nicholas. Those who knew about the history of Paul's relationship with his runaway bride were particularly stunned by the unexpected turn of events. Paul felt the devastation he had never felt before, and by Monday morning, he was already filing for divorce. He couldn't stand having his unfaithful wife under the same roof with him. Without a second thought, he put her things in shopping bags and left them outside the door. Although he understood the wrongness of this, and the fact that they had a child together. The thought of living in the same house with Susan made him physically sick. Even before the divorce was finalized, Susan moved in with Nicholas. She tried to convince their son to live with her, but, to her surprise, he chose to stay with Paul, and this decision brought him deep relief. Although he still hasn't recovered from the betrayal, his son's unwavering support didn't allow him to completely disintegrate. It didn't take long for cracks to appear in Susan and Nicholas's relationship. Just a month into their marriage, they had their first quarrel, which shed light on why Nicholas never married. During a heated exchange, his true nature was revealed. He became a tyrant, resorting to threats and even physical violence, which made Susan scared and shocked. At that moment, she realized her mistake, but it was too late. She couldn't repair the damage, couldn't return to her loving husband. Now, she was forced to face the consequences of her choice alone, trying to keep her sanity in the wreckage.